on your blank sheet of paper, the first thing we're going to write down is your f of x. Okay, so I want all of your attention up here. Just be with me. Okay, this will take us less than 10 minutes. Okay, so in your sine function, remember that we always start at 0, 0, and we end at 0, 0. Okay, so we're going to start and end on the axis. Okay, so your halfway point, okay, is also on your x-axis. And then if there's no reflection for f of x equals the sine of x, you're going to reach your max value halfway in between the first two, and then your min value halfway between the second two. And then we are just drawing one cycle. Okay, so this is one cycle of the sine function. In 11.4, we made our tables. So we have x and then f of x. And for each table, we had 5 points. Okay, so you are always going to start at 0, 0, end at the period, which is 0. You're going to find what's halfway between 0 and whatever the period is, and that will be 0. And then you're going to find your max and your min. When you are graphing these, give me a second to talk. When you guys are graphing these, the order that you want to go in is you always want to find the start. So 11.4 has no shifts left or right, so that's why you're always going to start at 0. That's the first point we find. The second point is where you end. The third point is the halfway. And then I usually do the max and then the min. So the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that's how you can graph them on your chart. Okay, and when you did your 11.4, you had changes in the amplitude, you had changes in the period, so you had to calculate these halfway points. Okay, when we went to 11.6, that's when we did the phase shift. And a phase shift is just a horizontal shift. So it means you're going to move left or right. It's just called a phase shift if you have the periodic function. So today you're going to be practicing those graphs. Okay, for the phase shift. And you start at the phase shift, but do you guys remember what we call that value? What letter is associated with it? H, yep. Okay, so H is where you're going to start. Okay, so we're going to start at, and then I've been calling the phase shift the PS for short. So if H is negative, that is possible. All right, and if it's a sine, the reason why we're starting at the phase shift is because that move is going to still be at 0 for your y, or your f of x value. Okay? Now, when you're doing the end, you have to do the period plus your h value. Okay? So when you're ending, it is the period plus the phase shift. So if h is negative, it ends up being plus a negative, so you are subtracting. And if h is positive, then you do end up adding them together. That is 0. and then your halfway is going to be 0 as well. So when you calculate the halfway point, it's the average of these two. Okay, so you can add the start plus the end and divide by 2 when you do the halfway. Start plus end, divide by 2. You could also use your scale on your graph. You're still going to reach your max halfway between those two. You're going to reach your min halfway between these two. Okay, once you have your start and your end, it's just the halfway, half of the halfway between those. Okay, and then we're going to do one cycle for the cosine of x. Okay, so when you do your practice today, we're going to use this to help us with our table. Okay, we can get more time with that table. So the what they're called, that will change from problem to problem. Okay, so for your cosine, your start value is not at 0. Your start x value is at 0, but your output is going to be the max. So you start at the max, you end at the max, and then when you are looking at that on the x scale, okay, if you start at 0 on the x, you end at your period, and then this halfway, in wherever you made the period, do try to make this halfway. It's okay if it's not perfect. I just want you to have a nice looking graph, okay? And then your min value is at the halfway, and then your intercepts are halfway in between those two. When you connect these, do not connect them sharply, okay? Don't connect them with a V. Remember, if we're having trouble with the curves, we can just curve this here. You curve these 3 points, and then this is starting to curve that way because it's going to be going down. This is also going to be a curve. Okay, so it's like a softer V shape there. Again, if it's not perfect, that's okay. We just want to represent what one cycle looks like. Okay, because when you graph this, this is the first part you graph, and then from there, we're just following the pattern. So in 11.4, which is where we did not have any transformations left or right, you had x, and then I just called this one g of x, so it would be different. Okay, we are always doing this table with 5 points. Okay, so we're going to start at 0, and our output is the max. Wherever you start, that's where you're going to end every single time. So if you start at 0, your ending point is going to be the period, and then your halfway is going to be the minimum. Okay, and then halfway between those is going to be 0. So those are your intercepts. Again, when you're graphing them, you do the start, you do the end, you do the halfway. Put it away. Okay, so you do the start, you do the end, halfway, and then halfway and halfway. All right, do you guys want to try to make the table for the phase shift one? Because that's what you're going to be working on today. Okay, so see if you can fill in the table with these values. Okay, you can also use 11.61. difference now is instead of starting at 0, where do you start? Yep, H. Okay, so whatever your phase shift is, that's where you're going to be starting. Okay, so you have H, and then here it's going to be the period plus H. Okay, and then so from there, we know we have our max, and our min. That does not change. Okay, and then this is our halfway, and then we have 0 and we have 0. Okay, and your H is always going to be what your phase shift is. All right, so that's how you're going to create your tables. Now we're going to do a couple other reminders and then we'll get started. So one thing you want to remember about the amplitude is it's always what? It's always positive. Okay, the amplitude is going to affect your max and your min. So when you do the absolute value of A, that's going to be your max value. Do you guys know how we're going to say what our min value is? It'll be the opposite of A. So we can just write negative A, which means the same thing. Okay, and then once you make your tables, the other part sometimes that people get confused about is the X scale. So do you guys remember that there's two things I told you that you could use for your X scale? If there's not a phase shift, what do you guys do? Yes, yep. So for your X scale, there's no phase shift. You can just take the period and divide by 4. Okay, an example would be if your period is 2 pi, you do 2 pi divided by 4, you could scale by pi over 2. Okay, and sometimes what we do is we scale every other one, and you can make that decision. Okay, so if you are using a scale of a period divided by 4, you want to do every other like tick mark on your graph, you can. Okay, if you have a phase shift, you can also use your phase shift. Which is really the absolute value of H, right? So if you have negative pi over 2, you could go by pi over 2. Okay, generally what you're going to do is you're going to use the smaller value. Because if you are doing a phase shift of pi, right? If you go by pi, you're going to be graphing a lot of waves. Okay, so whichever one of these is smaller is what you want to use. Okay, you can also use like a reference point. So let's say you had negative 3 pi over 2. Instead of going by 3 pi over 2, you could just go by pi over 2, which is like the kind of like a reference angle, right? If you had 3 pi over 4, you could go by pi over 4. Okay. All right, and then the other thing that you have to find are the equations for the x-intercepts. You guys remember how we found those, the equation? Sometimes it is the h value if it is sine, because that'll be your first intercept, right? Yep, yeah. So find the first x-intercept. I usually say at 0 or above, because sometimes it is 0, right? And if it is the sine, it is going to be your h value as well. Okay, and then you're going to add pi n. That's correct. Okay, what we didn't really talk about last time, the reason why it was always pi n, it's more than just that they occur every pi units. It's because all of the periods that we had were 2 pi. What's the relationship between pi and 2 pi? It's half of the period. Okay, And the only ones I gave you have a period of 2 pi today. Okay, so I tried to keep that part simple for now. Okay, and then the other things we had to find were the max. We call them the maxima and the minima because there's multiple. Okay, and so for that one, it's the same thing that we did before. Find the first max or min at 0 or above. Okay, but that wasn't plus 2 pi n. Do you guys know what it was? Found a guess though. 2 pi n. Because remember when we were finding the period, we went from max to max because this was our period. Okay, so it occurs every period. All right, so I'm going to give you guys the worksheet.